All right, everybody, we're going to kick it off. So I am Robert P. Jones. I am your host for the evening. This is the, what is it, fifth edition of the White Too Long Author Forum. So tonight we are really happy to have the Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey with us tonight. And we are going to talk about her new book, Antiracism as Daily Practice, Refuse Shame, Change White Communities, and Help Create a Just World. I've known Jennifer for a long time. We have done a couple of these, I think, on Zoom, and I don't know that we haven't done anything in person together, so we got to fix that
No,
at some point. But let me give you a little intro to the Reverend Dr. Harvey here. She's a writer and educator, long working in areas of racial justice. Her books include the New York Times bestseller, Raising White Kids. We're going to talk about that one a little bit too. Written for the New York Times, CNN, been on NPR's All Things Considered. She was for 20 years, served at Drake University as professor and associate provost. And she is now the vice president of academic affairs at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. So, Reverend Dr. Harvey, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Robbie. So glad to be with you. Thanks for being here with me.
And we're how many weeks in? When did it dropped when? The book, remind me.
July 16th. So
Yeah.
I think that's just 3 weeks, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I'm not sure. It's kind of a blur.
Yeah, well, it's been a great launch. I've seen it
Good.
all over the place.
Thanks.
Many of our folks are also subscribers to Diana Butler Bass's Substack, The Cottage. So you may have actually seen this. Maybe you're back for more. I don't know. Maybe you were there for that conversation as well. But we're glad to have her tonight. So I want to jump in and just talk about the arc. I'm always interested in writers who keep mining a vein, right, and are kind of working, and also books that are personal, that really, and I think one of the things I really admire about your work is that it's scholarly, it's informed, but it's also really personal. And you've been willing to put that personal journey on the page, which I also know is a vulnerable thing to do, and write in the first person, which the academic world does not sort of encourage you to do. So thank you for doing that. But I wanted to give you a little space to, take your time, but tell us a little bit about the arc from Dear White Christians, then Raising White Kids, and then Antiracism as Daily Practice.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I wrote Dear White Christians for those still longing for racial reconciliation. I wrote it. It was ready to come out in fall of 2014. And I wrote that book after having done, I started doing racial justice work explicitly, wrestling with whiteness and my own identity as a white person in my early 20s. I'm now in my mid 50s, so that's almost 30 years. And Dear White Christians, I wrote about my understanding of why those of us who are justice seeking, I knew there were a lot of justice seeking white Americans who felt really stuck around multiracial community, what we needed to be doing differently, especially from a faith and Christian committed perspective. And so I wrote that book and talked about reparative justice being the framing we needed to take up, instead of an overemphasis on reconciliation, which really should come out of good repair work, but isn't even a guarantee, right? So I wrote that book. It just so happened, timing wise, that it came out the month after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And so that book was not particularly personal, actually, in a vulnerable way. It didn't have much of my own story. It was kind of almost a manifesto. And what happened was so many white Christians woke up after Michael Brown was killed, and the youth in Ferguson rose up, and Black Lives Matter became much more visible on the national radar. And my book came out, and folks picked it up because they were trying to understand why we were really stuck where I was arguing in that book. We were pretty much stuck where we were stuck by the end of the 1960s, that we hadn't made much progress since then. And so I found myself invited into all of these conversations, especially in churches, who were saying, how did we miss this? Like, what did we not see? And that makes us now understand we're actually not as far along as we thought. So that work was really exciting, powerful, hard. And every single time I was in space, like for 2 years all over the country, someone in a workshop or a lecture I would give on that work would stand up and say, okay, police brutality, reparative justice. Also, I have kids. What should I be telling my kids? When do I talk to them about this? And I thought, let me find a book, right? Like, I'm sure I can give you a resource. Well, and then I looked around and there's lots of books about racism's effect on kids of color. There was almost nothing about raising white
Check
kids.
Focus on the Family Library to see if there's
Yeah, right. They've got it down there. I grew up on Focus on the Family. I already knew what they said. So I was raising two white kids at that point, and they were young. They were like 4 and 6 when Michael Brown was killed. And so I just thought, well, what am I doing? And how am I talking to my kids? And I was, but I hadn't sort of theorized it. And so I wrote Raising White Kids, not because I'm a social scientist or a psychologist or a children's educator. But I wrote it as a parent and just said, like, okay, here's what race conscious justice committed parenting can look like. And also, I'm not really sure, because this is a work in progress. We haven't generationally done this in the US. So I wrote that book and I had to get vulnerable in that, because I was, actually writing about my own journey. And so that book came out in 2018. Similarly found myself in all of these conversations with teachers now at nonprofits, also churches still, parenting groups. And not unlike what happened with Dear White Christians, every single time someone would stand up at some point and say, you know what? I get it. This is making sense. This is helpful. And also I'm realizing this isn't about me parenting. This is me having to reparent myself. I didn't get this. I need to relearn some things as the adult. So I realized really early in that journey, engaging with folks, that this was also, there's this like yearning for developmentally appropriate sort of generational transformation that white adults now trying to parent for justice hadn't gotten. So I had started thinking at that point, okay, so here again, a need I'm hearing by being engaged with folks. And so I started thinking, well, what would an adult book look like? And Antiracism as Daily Practice then was kind of born out of that. Again, like all 3 books feel to me a little bit like call and response. Like I was in spaces with folks, I heard a need, I was challenged, invited to see if I could lean into that. And Antiracism as Daily Practice emerged because that was a question, like, what's the book for adults that's really concrete? And then also, George Floyd was murdered in 2020, and Breonna Taylor's murder came to everyone's awareness. And all of these white folks got in the street, Robbie, and I know you're experiencing this, that like there are a lot of white Americans who actually really do want to be on the right side of justice. And I knew when I saw all these white folks in Des Moines, Iowa, where I was, pouring into the streets who'd never been there before, I thought, okay, I know, because it happened to me when I woke up in my 20s and was like, there's a crisis. That didn't necessarily mean I knew what to do. And so I felt aware there was going to be just a profound need for some very concrete next steps. And I had excitement about how much moral curiosity folks were showing, in some ways in mass, at levels I had never seen in my entire life. So that's how this book came to be.
I so appreciate that. I'm going to read what I wrote because I was very honored to endorse your book. But here's what my takeaway was. I called it an essential book of practical wisdom, because that's really how it struck me, right? And I said, if you're white and you've been asking, what can I do now? This lively and timely book is for you. Because I get that a lot too, like, okay, so I'm with you. I get it. Now what?
Now what?
Right?
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yep.
What can we do?
Yep.
And so I so appreciate like bringing it down to the ground. And I actually love the messiness of the examples that you give in the book, because they're not, because I think what's so intimidating, right, is if you only read examples of people who have some kind of uncanny emotional intelligence and have like navigated this very complicated thing so perfectly,
Yeah.
right? And they come out and everybody's still friends and it's all like rosy. But you talk a lot about the importance, I think, of the messiness, and I think there's a way in which it gives people permission to just try stuff, right? And kind of follow their instincts and just try, even if it doesn't work out, even if they fall, get back up, try something again.
And if I can show my mess on a page for like whoever wants to pick it up and read it, then you can too. Like, that it's my mess on the page because I wanted to like make it really like companioning, right? Like we aren't actually going to do any of this successfully if we don't make a mess, because it's not possible, right? And so, yeah, it's like taking steps towards, I really wanted to show folks without doing kind of gross white confessional, like forgive me stuff. That wasn't what it was about, but I wanted to show like, well, this is what it looked like when I was first learning even to say like Black, like, or, feeling so excited that I want Black friends, right? And then making a mess of that because that eagerness did not feel good to folks, like, so that's where some of the storytelling and vulnerability came from, because I think we have to be willing to like live messy. And that means some of us have to be willing to show that too, so that folks feel some more supported in being willing to take the risk, I think.
Yeah, I just want to go back real quick and flag a couple of things. Well, one, a practical thing is we're going to go until about 8 o'clock or so, Jennifer and I, and then we're going to take some questions. So if you want to go ahead and load some questions in the Q&A slot, we'll work our way over to those around 8 o'clock. But I want to go back and just flag the reconciliation repair piece, because that was like really important for me, because I had your book in my hand when I was writing White Too Long. And I remember, I cite you in there.
I know, I read it. I was, yes, you did.
But I remember like that was such a key thing. I was like, oh yeah, that's where we're stuck. We're stuck with this, kumbaya, promise keepers, kind of,
Yep.
put our arms around each other, but there's no room in there for justice, really. If it's all about feeling good and just kind of being together, I mean, that's all great, but it only gets you so far, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't then raise the hard issues of justice or injustice,
Yep.
it's hard to do in that context, because that might not make you feel so good, right? If you raise the questions of injustice, and might break down the fellowship and the reconciliation in a way.
Absolutely.
But
if we don't do it, then it's actually just white reconciliation, because people of color have no interest in, collectively, very little stake in a reconciliation that doesn't have repair in it.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I called it cheap grace, and and a pretty good deal if you're white. If you could just get reconciliation, call it done.
Can we get to the forgiveness part? Could we get to the forgiveness part? Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, I just wanted to sort of thank you for that insight.
Yeah.
That sort of you came from there. So, I want to talk about the first thing here. So in the first word in the subtitle, or the phrase in the subtitle, is refuse shame. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like the resistance factors of guilt and shame, right? That show up. I think particularly at the beginning of this work, when people are kind of feeling, okay, I know I need to do this work, but oftentimes the resistance factors are like, but yeah, I don't know if I want to like that monkey on my back, right? And how can I really deal with that, or what do I do with it if I raise all that up and I'm fully kind of right in front of me all the time? What do I do with that? So maybe say a little bit more about that sort of guilt, shame, and why you said refuse shame there.
Yeah, that's the only line of the subtitle I had to really go to bat for with my publisher, who was like, I don't know, the shame. Yes, it's the right phrase. So I guilt and shame both are going to continually show up for white folks as long as white supremacy is pervasive in our social reality. Because if we're justice committed and white supremacy is pervasive, it elicits guilt and shame. We're going to contend with that always. Guilt is a little easier because guilt has more to do with things that we do that are wrong or bad or harmful, for which we can learn to repair, engage in repentance, make different choices, and show up differently. And so I use the word metabolize. Guilt is easier to metabolize. We do get, many of us, stuck in white guilt if we don't get skills building in how to repair, but it's a little more like, I am the person, but I did a bad thing. Shame is really tricky because shame is like, I am the bad thing. And shame, I'm not even sure how we metabolize shame, except that I know we have to bring it into the sunlight. And so even talking about shame, even right now, when I talk about racial shame and white folks, I can feel myself getting a little clammy, because it's like, this stuff is so deep seated in our sort of collective generational legacies. And there's part of the experience of being white, I think, that others have written about far more eloquently than I, but that elicits this sense of like, maybe I really am just bad. And so the problem with shame right now is not only that we need containers in which we can talk about shame if we're going to get any traction over it, because shame leaves us really stuck. There's an activist, Richie Reseda, who calls shame a neurotoxin. We can't even process things. We can't engage in good collaborative work if shame is in the room. But it's really difficult to do if shame gets weaponized. And we are in a moment right now. Part of the reason I said refuse shame is that since 2020, white anti-racism has become much more visible, a collective project many more people are bought into. And we have also, I'm seeing this emerging tendency where, because there's a lot of shame in white communities, when we move into a justice space, there's a kind of incentive to be like, ooh, that white person over there, they're doing things or acting ignorant in ways that I don't want to get associated with. And so my behavior, my response to them, because I don't want to be associated with them, is going to be to like throw a little shame their way to create some distance and kind of keep my own pure anti-racist credentials. And it's still, I'm having shame, but I'm just worried my stuff's going to get exposed if I get close to this other white person. And there's this collective experience we're in right now culturally where there's a lot of weaponizing of shame in the public discourse. And so I decided in this book, in some ways, this is far more vulnerable for me to write about than my own mess up stories. Those I'm pretty familiar with, and like, I can talk about that. In this book, I talk about how white folks need to actively refuse, spiritually fast from weaponizing shame against one another. Because if I'm going to throw shame at other white folks, I cannot companion them in the collective journey of growing a movement of multiracial justice that we need more white folks to get into, because shame just shuts people down and shuts them out. It also fixes them in time as if they are not redeemable or can't transform. And I don't believe that. And actually, if I did believe that, I wouldn't be involved in justice work, because what would be the point? So I feel like we're in this sort of hard place with our justice work in some ways. And I wanted to encourage white folks to decide that we need to find ways to companion one another rather than throw folks out the first time they make a mistake. Now, I want to say one quick thing. There is a time to strategically call people out, especially people in power who have decision-making capacity and lots of, that can be a political strategy that's effective. But interpersonally, it's a tool that we should not use very often. And I really think many of us are sort of increasingly afraid to tiptoe into anti-racism space because we're a little bit afraid that we're going to get shamed if we go there. And so I feel like we need to stop doing that.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this language is in all of these anti-critical race theory bills, right, that are kind of popping up all over the country. I think there's only like a dozen states that have not had one of these bills be introduced. And they talk about the language they pick up was actually, they all copycatted a Donald Trump executive order, right, that was targeting the 1619 Project originally.
Right.
So that's the context all this kind of comes out of. But the language that they use, right, is sounds on the face of it, of course, like kind of commonsensical. But like you put it in this context, it means something quite different. They say that no white children should be made to feel uncomfortable.
Oh yeah,
right?
uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about like what's at stake there.
Yeah.
Why all the energy being spent on that. And what's at stake, not just for kind of public education in general, but like what's at stake for white kids if those laws get kind of pushed down the pike that way?
Oh my gosh. I mean, for white kids who will eventually be white adults, right, who are denied the opportunity to learn the full nuanced story about how we all together are in relationship across racial lines, right? It's a misnomer to think that Black History Month is only about Black people, for example, right? Like our history in the United States is a shared racial history. So to pass bills, and I live in Iowa, so we have passed this bill, you know, and Nicole Hannah-Jones is from Waterloo, Iowa, to deny white children the ability to wrestle with the entirety of their history in educational spaces where they are supported with sort of also the multiple models that are out there for how we actually also transform and change history. Like it, I mean, the stakes for, first of all, it's actually not, it's not actually good for white kids, right? It stunts their development. It generates cognitive dissonance in their ability to function in the world. And it's also really based on, I mean, I understand it's also being politically mobilized sort of in a cynical way, obviously, but it's also, even the language of not made to feel uncomfortable, I think there's a way in which it's a misunderstanding of what anti-racist and full racial history storytelling can engender, which is that I don't need to be left in discomfort if I'm offered pathways and on-ramps to living a different way as a citizen of this nation, right? And so the stakes are so high because of this, that we already had historical amnesia in this country. And so those bills, if they, you know, stay in place, will have a whole generation of much worse. I'm going to put on my earbuds because I think I hear pipes running upstairs. I don't.
Okay. Yeah.
With the sound. Sorry.
No, while you're doing that, so you know, we just passed James Baldwin's what would have been his 100th birthday, right?
Yeah.
And he talks so eloquently about, you know, the need to know your history, right? And if you don't know your history, like you have to have a history that's useful to the future, right? But you can't do that if you don't even know it, right? If it's a myth or a lie. And I'll just
like
give you
butterflies pinned, right? Butterflies pinned, like if we don't know our history.
One reaction I had though, like as I've, you know, become an adult, and like, so I grew up in Mississippi, right? Very fraught, maybe the most fraught state in the country. And I remember, like, as I got little pieces of the story, as I got older and get an adult, like, you know, I graduated high school, I'd never heard of Emmett Till. I'd never heard of Medgar Evers, and Medgar Evers was shot 9 miles from my driveway where I grew up. But like, as I got more of those pieces, there was like a this sort of recognition in me that like the world began to make sense. It was kind of like, like that's why it looked like that, and that's why these people this way. Like it all started because there was all this, you use cognitive dissonance, there was all this weird like cognitive dissonance, right? And being, it's like you're being raised and told everything around you is normal, right? And really we were living in the aftermath of an apartheid state. Right. But nobody explained it that way. And once I kind of got it, I was like, and, you know, like that was really my experience.
What does it do to children and youth too? I'm more curious if you like to then realize, oh, all these elders who cared for me also told me lies.
Oh, I was so mad. Yeah.
The interpersonal, familial, relational impact of that. Most of us who are white who've really walked in this journey have had severe reckonings with people that the folks that were supposed to be, you know, caretaking us. That's huge.
Right. Pastors, Sunday school teachers. Teachers. Yeah. Right.
Grandparents.
Right. So, all right. Well, I want you to read. We're getting close to 8, but I wanted you to read a section because I found this section both kind of amusing and poignant, of the kind of tape that runs through, I think many of our, if you're white, it runs through your head when you're thinking about getting involved and thinking about doing something. So if you wouldn't mind reading this little, it's in a chapter about the paradox.
And I'll just frame it for those of you listening real quick. This short piece I'm going to read is part of my attempt in this book to help us understand that the messy, slow work of this is not something we're going to be able to just do with a 10-point checklist, and to be a place to encourage folks that we can learn to navigate the tensions that I'm going to read in this excerpt. And so my book tries to help model that, give tools for that. But here's the piece about paradox for those of us that have found ourselves struggling to know where to enter this movement. Our civic crisis has created a particular kind of intensity in anti-racism spaces. This intensity has generated lots of directive coaching. It's almost like those of us engaged with questions about white roles have collectively authored a Wikipedia page. The page is full of community-authorized lists of white people do's and don'ts. The clarity and focus of this collective project have been fantastic and necessary. Vital even. Books like this one sit squarely within the confines of this project. But the emotional and intellectual intensity of the conversation can be overwhelming. For example, are white people supposed to speak up about racism? Yes. Or are we supposed to pass the mic to people of color and stop taking up so much space? Also, yes. Are we supposed to step in to make our neighborhoods and workplaces more inclusive? Or does that mean we're being patronizing and playing the white savior? Yes, and it depends. We're not supposed to get emotional because it's not about us, right? Right, that's white fragility. See chapter 5. But wait, we've got to stop being apathetic and untouched by racism's violence. Yep, absolutely. See chapter 5 again. We've never experienced being the targets of racism, so we need to listen and learn from listen to and learn from people of color, right? White people can't fix this. We can't know what we don't know. Yes. But we've got to stop expecting people of color to educate us and instead do our own work. There it is, and then a reference to an earlier story about Ava DuVernay. Also, since white people are responsible for white supremacy, we are responsible for ending it. Racism is a white problem. This is getting really complicated. And oh my God, what if I say or do something wrong? What happens when I totally miss the mark while trying to pull off these complicated responsibilities well? Will my reputation be ruined on social media? Will I be canceled at the PTA? Maybe I should just stay out of this altogether. See how this can go? Thanks.
Yeah, so help us. Where do we go? What's the solution then? Because it sounds paralyzing when you know, and that is, I mean, those partial tapes have run through my head for
Absolutely.
sure.
Yeah. We got to navigate paradox. We got to support each other in doing it. And there's an art to that, and there's a long game in that.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the sort of, I don't know how to characterize it as gentleness or grace, or that you're inviting us to give each other as we stumble around, I think, in this space. I think particularly if people are, you know, trying to act out of good faith, right?
Yeah.
However clumsily, you know, we're all doing it. And I think that the fact that we don't have blueprints, right, for this. Like, you know, the previous generation did not generate those blueprints and hand them down.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. And so, yeah, the first part of the book, I say, like, why is this so hard? And I talk about that because if we had mentoring, then a different level of a different point in the journey could be expected, right? So we have to live into the expectation. It's not giving us a pass, but there's a reason it feels so hard, and nobody who might be listening and thinking, yeah, this has felt hard, is alone in that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me invite people. I may ask one more question here. If you've got questions, to stick them in the Q&A here, and I'll monitor the chat too in case you're having trouble with the Q&A box. But do pop them in the Q&A, and I'll kind of get to them as we go. So while we're waiting on that, I'm going to ask you one more other thing that I think is also the hardest thing I get asked, and that is, what about family?
Yeah.
Like how you know, it's easier in many ways to kind of do something at the PTA or you know, stand up for racial justice or a community group, you know, but we're about to enter a really difficult season here over the next few months between Labor Day and Election Day. You know, that'll have Thanksgiving right on the backside.
Yep. Oh my gosh. About to enter. That's where we've been, and it's about to get harder.
It's going to get more intense, that we've got 2 tickets and then everything's right off, you know, off to the races. So maybe you can answer that, and then we'll go to some questions. Like, so you do have some advice, some pointers, some tips.
Chapter 8, what do we do with our families? And I talk about the motto I have tried to live into with myself, and that I write about, is stay in it, stay in it, stay in it again until it's clearly time to leave. And what that means to me is, I think that family is about the most difficult place. It also means if we can learn to stay in it there, we get better and better at doing it other places. And it also is the case that the fact that so many of us woke up in 2016 and were like, oh, before we were at extended tables with folks we maybe could agree to disagree. Now we're sitting at a table where there's folks who endorsed hate. And what do we do with that? And so a lot of us felt tempted to sort of put our heads down and just get through it or not go home. And so I talk about and describe through my own storytelling with my own very, very Trump supporting extended family, different pathways to trying to find small moments of shared values where you can maybe build over time with folks. I talk about not always needing to have an argument when you go at home, but committing with the self to always showing one's values. So for example, I got asked a question once at dinner, like, what are you teaching? And I was teaching reparations. So I said that, I knew, and it immediately made people upset, but I knew, I could have truthfully said, oh, I'm teaching history, but I knew like living my values in my family means being my authentic self. And then we work through it. And so I describe threads where growth happened over time. And there's some times where it doesn't, and I've had to walk away. But I think we need people, we need to know who's going to support us, and we need folks to help us practice and say, this is going to come up at Thanksgiving. Can you help me practice how I'm going to handle it? And know that we don't have to win. We have to live true to our values. We're modeling for the next generation, and we need to try and stay in it as long as we can.
Yeah, it's real. I remember in 2016, PRI actually did some survey, and I don't have the number right in front of me, but we actually asked people after the 2016 election if they were going to shorten their trips with family over the holidays. And we had it wasn't like a majority, but it was a non-negligible minority of Americans, like something like 15, 20% saying, yeah, we're going to shave a few days off the family gathering, just because I think people were feeling completely stressed out about how to navigate that. Well, let's go to Lori. We have a question from Lori. So Lori says, as a person of color who experienced the enthusiasm of white people after George Floyd's murder, and then the disappointment and the subsequent dropping away of white people after they realize this is long, hard work. Can you speak to helping or encouraging white people to do this work and stay in for the long haul, creating a foundation to hold one another in the complicated messiness? It's a very eloquent question.
It is. Thank you, Lori. And I want to acknowledge the pain of that, of watching so many white folks say, oh, we get it, we're here, and then seem to drop away. I think a few things. I think that and this is not me telling you who identifies as a person of color that this is what you should do. I think what white folks need, and what we need to certainly provide one another, and when people of color in our lives can help us and are willing to sort of point and encourage in these ways, great, that we need to be encouraged and challenged to really plug in the local level, because what happened in 2020 was such a specific sort of moment between the pandemic, how much local organizing various BIPOC groups for justice had done all over the country since, forever, but especially since 2010, Black Lives Matter in particular. And there was just kind of a readiness that made that particular moment like a groundswell and the organizing was powerful. And that kind of momentum, especially when the sort of target, like police brutality, right, is sort of all over the place, is not really a sustainable in and of itself kind of moment. And so where do the white folks go after that? Well, I think white folks need to be encouraged to plug in locally, because we need to grow our skills with real people in the places that we live. Because when we do that, first of all, we're more in it for the long haul when we're in relationship. And that doesn't really happen at protests, right? Relationship building happens when you're in sort of week in, wake out work in your local context, is one of the best places for that. And then the other thing is when we're in relationship and we can, like, say it's a school board meeting, when we get little victories with others we've been collaborating with, we also start to better understand how much racial justice, all forms of justice, but racial justice in particular, is such long haul work. And so I like to really focus on encouraging folks to build relationships. Sometimes that means like a local surge chapter, because sometimes white folks aren't racially responsible enough to be in interracial relationships well, and so need to really be in spaces with other white folks, so some other white folks who have more experience can kind of mentor and companion them for a bit. But I think I also want to say one more thing about the way that the mobilization that has happened specifically for white folks in response to Kamala Harris's candidacy, which has been quite impressive, actually. The call, like, I don't think we would have seen in 2015, 2012, white women calls and calls for white dudes. And that's not me patting white folks on the back, but I do think that the kind of waking up that's been happening for some time, even before 2020, because 2020 folks got in the streets because there'd already been so much work also emerging. I think we're actually seeing right now that lots of that consciousness raising that happened actually didn't completely disappear and fall completely off the radar. I think it showed up in different places, and that we're seeing now that, oh, actually some of it's still here. It's different, but I don't think without 2020, we would be seeing what we're seeing right now with the sort of mobilization of white folks. And I think that's significant because I think the arc and where and when connection and work happens can be really, if it's not on the front page of the news, then where are we seeing it? And so just sort of noticing that too, I think can be helpful.
Yeah, I was going to kind of reflect one thing back on this, just my own reflections of about justice, and and feeling frustrated when there's organizing and then like nothing happens, or it goes the opposite way, or there's backlash. And I do think it sort of where like some of my own, like being white and thinking about justice and thinking that, you assert a principle, it's on the right side of history and it wins, right? That sort of naive like view of things, right?
Yeah.
Instead of realizing like how many things did not work, right? Before you got a victory. And like how many dead ends people went down before, something came through. And I do think there's a way in which like that sense of like, this is the way it goes, right? It's not a straight line. It's a very circuitous thing. And only in retrospect can you maybe even draw the line, when you're looking back on, because there's so many weird contingencies, but it's the cumulative effort, right, that brings it along. And just kind of trying to not be, I think, naive about that. And I think it was easy for me to get discouraged, but I think it was realized because, well, I really not had to be in these kind of struggles before on my own behalf in a lot of ways, right? I'm a straight white male, living in a context where I was told I was at the top of the pyramid, right?
And where your asks get responded to, right? And so so that's a new thing. But there's a piece I was also thinking about, there was this group of grandparents in Des Moines, Iowa, where I live, and some clergy, a number of clergy, who well after 2020, the large protests had sort of quelled, but although there were here too in Des Moines for a long time, and Black youth continued to march through the streets at random times, and folks would come out of their houses for a very long time. And there was this group of grandparents who would sit in front of the police station. There were about 10 of them every day for like 2 years, trying to be, and they were wanting the especially the Black youth who had been arrested and physically mistreated during those protests to get justice in Des Moines, Iowa. And I kept noticing that. Now that's not on the front page news, but that is also changing the world. Like every time people drove down, they saw this group of grandparents and some clergy every day holding vigil for an hour outside the police department. And that is significant too. That came out of 2020 in the local context, and we don't necessarily see it, but it's there. And so I do think that kind of thing has happened all over the place. Yeah.
And the other thing I would reflect back on too, again, not to like say it's all good, but it's that I've experienced is that I would say before 5 years ago, for sure, certainly before 2020, it was not very common, like for me to go to a church and for them to have on the marquee, like explicitly on the marquee out on the front lawn, that they were going to have a conversation about white supremacy, like use the word white supremacy.
Oh, absolutely.
And now that's not that uncommon.
Yes.
Now,
Agreed.
sometimes some of them I'm not giving them much of a choice because they put the title of my book out there. It has the word white supremacy,
Good for you.
but nonetheless,
They brought you though, right?
that's right. Yeah, and having hard conversations, and
Yep.
so I do think there's some slow, work being done. It's certainly different than anything I've seen in my lifetime, right? In
Absolutely.
the last 5 to 10 years, or
Absolutely.
certainly different.
I had the question in my head this week because in 2020, journalists kept asking, are we at the start of a racial reckoning? And, in the book, I say, well, I'm not ready to say no, but I'm certainly not going to say yes. But this week, when I was watching the calls for Kamala Harris be called, I was like, okay, so maybe what if the question was like, what does a racial reckoning look like anyway? Like, because maybe maybe there's something else happening and it's just not appearing how we thought it might when we use that language. But this is absolutely, this moment right now is connected to the last 4 years, 8 years, 12 years.
I think that's right. And I've also, I mentioned the kind of critical race theory bills that are bouncing around all over the country, but I've also taken that to be a backlash movement, right? It's a reaction. And so what's it a reaction to? It's a reaction to something positive moving, right? So I think there's a wind blowing, however uneven, whatever. But I think that is a backlash. And I think so often doing this work, you sort of feel on the defensive. But in this case, I actually think that critical race theory movement is on the defensive, right? That's a defensive movement.
That's right.
Happening in the country, which I take to be good. So again, if you want to put a question in, we will get to it. I got one more. I've got questions I can say with all day, but I want to talk to you about the kind of what parallels or intersections or overlaps, I don't know how you want to describe it, between the work for LGBTQ plus equality and racial justice work. Because I know you've worked in both of those spaces, sometimes together, sometimes separate. And maybe you just reflect on what feels similar and what maybe feels different between those movements.
So sort of on the sort of bigger like collective side of it, it was true for many years that and I think we've made significant changes in this way on this front as well, but that sort of there was this idea that if you were pro LGBTQ, or if you were LGBTQ, you already had your stuff together, which itself was kind of a white infused way of thinking about what queer or queer identity might automatically yield in terms of capacity around anti-racism. And it was also a very white way of thinking about who the LGBTQ community was. And so there was, I was in a lot of spaces in the late 90s and early 2000s where queer people were gathering, especially in the church, for justice work, and they were incredibly white, and almost every single one of them, something deeply racist happened. And so those movements over time, within LGBTQ spaces, there's been really important work and real transformations to say, like, if we're not starting with Black folks and brown folks and trans folks when we think about who's LGBTQ, then we're automatically going to be thinking about justice in very justice sort of for those of us who already have lots of privilege built in. It's just going to land that way. So there's a way that sort of intersectionality around racial justice and LGBTQ issues is necessary. And I think awareness of that has grown in queer spaces. But one of the things I'd love the chance to say something about that I started playing with it in this book a little bit as a queer person was realizing that for white folks who are wanting to step into anti-racism and sort of identify and sort of deeply commit, engage family, or try and figure out how we be in family spaces when we're taking on that identity, and that might be counter to our family culture. I started realizing that that those of us who are queer and have had to come out and take the risk of losing family, we've done that partly because we've had to, but partly because we've also gotten a sense that something better is out there, something liberative is out there, freedom is out there. And I started realizing that trying to come out as anti-racist as a white person actually has some really similar cadences to it. And the similar kinds of risks to relationship rupture, and that we also need, if we're going to sort of grow the movement, to be claiming this reality that is joyful, liberative, and freedom-inducing to be on a on a journey against white supremacy, because white supremacy is bad for everybody, and it's death dealing for white folks too. And so I just think the sort of learnings around, I think there's reasons that queer people have been overrepresented in anti-racist work, white queer folks. And I think it's partly because we've already learned how to, grow resilience even at the risk of losing our parents, and that white folks actually, in the case of anti-racism, have to be willing to kind of learn some similar things.
Yeah, I'm going to get you to extend this a little bit, because you have a couple of one thing that's really helpful about the book is that you've got some nice phrases that sort of stick in your brain, like the one you already talked about, staying in it, right? Staying in it, like just little mantras that I think are helpful. The other one I think that you talked about is this productive instability.
Yes.
In relationships, which is close to what you're talking about now. But maybe just say a little bit more about what you mean by productive instability.
Yeah, productive instability, I think of as, when we're in a family system, there's a culture in that family. We've learned how to be in the culture if we've stayed, if we're talking about a family I've grown up in, right? Like, so I'm thinking about right now, my siblings and my aunts and uncles and my parents and grandparents. There's a family culture. And for those of us who are whiteness is sort of infused in the relational bonds and in the culture. And so some of those pressures and fears around talking about the election or talking about anti-racism or challenging racism when it shows up are because it's not about just our individual values. It's because we're actually having to challenge a whole culture. And it's destabilizing to the culture when you're disruptive in some way, even if it's disruptive in a very small kind way. Disruption doesn't have to be like fighting. But so I have a yoga teacher that always talks about how, when you're holding a pose and you start to shake, that's just when it really gets good, because when you start to shake, that's when something new can grow. And so I think actually generating instability in family cultures or relational cultures where whiteness is part of the relational bond is necessary for anything new and different to grow. And I think the gift of that, and of stories we could share with one another about what sometimes does grow, is that if we're just sort of staying in the stasis of what is, it can be hard to imagine something new could happen. But sometimes new things do happen. Like, I've been in a dialogue with my own mother, for 30 years, and we're having conversations now we never could have had in my 30s. We were having them then, but they turned out very differently. And now, like, it's different things have grown between us and in me and in her. And so productive instability, I think, is a goal we should have when we're in cultures when ease comes with white racial bonding. We should seek dis-ease when bonding is happening over racism.
Yeah, and I've certainly had some experience too. And what I found is, like, at least for me, like, the first time you break that little covenant, right? The sort of silent covenant is harder.
Yep.
Right. But like, once you do it once, it's almost like if something gets said, the eyes sort of turn toward you because you've broken the covenant before, right? And like, so what are you going to say,
That's
now? That kind of thing. So, and I think people start being a little more thoughtful about it as well. So,
and sometimes, I don't know if this happened to you, but a couple times in my life with family, then like someone who was there would call me and be like, hey, I was actually bothered by that too. And the fact that you said something surprised me, but I'm glad you did. And like, next thing you know, you have an ally in your family who's like gonna also, then there's two of you who are gonna say the thing, and the culture can literally shift if you stay in it again. And it doesn't always happen. And sometimes there's a time to leave too, if you're emotionally unsafe or, but being proactive and thinking we can make change with the people that we love, or at least are in lifelong relationship with, I think is a good place to start.
Great. We're getting close to time here. What I usually do is, here we go. Let's see. So we don't have to win. We just have to stay true to our values. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. Thanks indeed for that. I think I'd just leave you with maybe answer kind of the last question. So, you spent a lot of time. I love what you said about thinking about this is the adult version of raising white kids.
Yeah.
It's funny. I read the book very carefully, and for whatever reason, it didn't exactly strike me that way. But I actually love that. I love that metaphor. So, maybe I'll leave you with you're a professor, you're an educator in churches and other spaces on the ground. Like, what work do you want this book to do in the world? Like, what's your hopes for it? They're always like children we send out into the world with
I
hopes,
know.
and yeah,
Do well.
yeah.
I really hope that in all kinds of different contexts where we have our regular everyday lives, that folks who engage this book will be able to name concretely 1, 2, or even 3 things that they are able to do in a sphere of influence they have to move the needle even this much. And that folks all over different contexts, different mundane sorts of daily lives feel like if they don't know how to move the needle, that they know what the next task is to learn the skill that would help them move the needle. That's what I hope, is that folks really come away feeling equipped with some concrete, actionable ideas, not about what it looks like if they were me being in the spaces I am, but what it looks like for them given the spaces that they are in, because we don't all have to be capital A activists out organizing protests in the streets. We are literally all changing the world every single day. And so that's my greatest hope, is that folks will literally leave thinking like, oh, actually, there's all these things that I am either already doing and could do even more strongly and more boldly, or that I'm going to commit to learning how to do, and that I'm going to find some people to go with me along the way. I'm going to cheerlead them and they're going to cheerlead me. And then it just creates all kinds of different kind of moments in all kinds of different local contexts. That's my greatest hope.
Well, if I put my growing up vernacular, that sounds a lot like Christian discipleship.
Yeah.
So thanks for
Yeah.
that.
Thanks, Robbie. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. So the book is Anti-Racism as Daily Practice, Refuse Shame, Change White Communities, and Help Create a Just World, by the Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey. So, Jen, thanks so much for being with us
Yes.
tonight. And stay in it. I'll stay in it. Thanks for
Okay,
that.
I will too. Thanks,
All
y'all,
right.
for listening. Be
Good
well.
night all.
Bye-bye.